In 1936, there was held in London the World Congress of Faith. And I remember it had a chief meeting at one of the great auditoriums of London, in which the most distinguished speakers at this conference were invited to talk for half an hour each on the supreme spiritual ideal. There was a representative of Christianity, a representative of Islam, a representative of Hinduism, and a representative of Buddhism, and the last was Dr. Suzuki Daisetsu. And I listened. Speaker after speaker got up and talked for half an hour in terms of pure quintessence of hot air. Vague, vast, wild aspirations with no concrete content whatsoever. Finally, little Suzuki got up with his beetling eyebrows and said, "I am supposed tonight to talk about supreme spiritual ideal. I'm not sure what supreme spiritual ideal is, so I look it up in dictionary. I'm not understanding at all what I find in dictionary. You Western people talk so much about spiritual things, but when I walk down Regent Street in London, I don't understand your spiritual attitude." Because, he explained, that we didn't seem to be able to get what we called the spiritual connected with the material. Because he couldn't say, what he was saying was, he couldn't understand spirituality apart from materiality. And so the rest of his talk, instead of being spent in vague generalities, was an extremely delightful description of his house and his garden in Japan, which I must say was a change from the rest of the orations. And it is, isn't it, a funny thing that when people talk about spiritual matters, when they preach and when they talk about religion, there's something about it that never quite comes through. It isn't grounded. It stays in a watertight compartment all of its own, like religion for Sundays. It remains academic. And that's not because people who profess spiritual ideals would, as we say, fail to apply them. That's an ancient misunderstanding. You see, if you go to any church in the Western world and to many, many churches or temples in the Eastern world, what you will hear there as a content of the message boils down to this: my dear people, you ought to be good. You ought to love each other. You ought to love God, whatever that may be. And this is the way we should live. We are describing you the ideal life. And everybody knows that they're not going to do it. And it's not going to work out like that. It never did and it never has done. And so they preach it all the more strongly and say, "Come on now, everybody, get with it. Do this thing, you ought to." And the preacher, to be modest, has also to say, "I ought to, and I'm in just the same situation as all of you are, but I don't do it either." And so we all say how very sad it all is, and we ought to somehow do something or other to get the energy to bring the ideal into actualization. And so you may be perfectly sure that the moment anybody talks about ideals, it's not going to happen. Because wherever there is this sense of saying to yourself, I should, or as St. Paul put it, to will is present with me, but how to do that which is good I find not. For the good that I would, that I do not, but the evil that I would not, that I do. And no truer words were ever said. Because nobody ever transforms himself into an enlightened pattern of life by dividing himself in two pieces, good I and bad me, wherein good I preaches to bad me and tries to make me over. As if a human being were divided, were like a rider on a horse, and the rider is the soul and the horse is the body, or the rider is reason and the horse is passion, the rider is control and the horse is the uncontrolled. In other words, we've got the opposition of the ego allied with the superego, trying to ride the ego aligned with the id. And Freud's metaphors and Freud's construction of the sort of psychic anatomy of mankind is really derived from Plato, with the image of the soul riding the animal horse. Now, all this is a total failure, because there is a secret connection, as it were a sort of backstairs, between good I and bad me. Good I can look down at bad me and say, you oughtn't to be like that. But all the time, bad me is sending its energy up the backstairs to good I and motivating good I to go at bad me, but for the reasons of bad me. I ought to be better, because then I could be more proud of myself. So, in this way, there is something about spirituality, self-conscious spirituality, all kinds of religion involving preaching and moralizing and talking to oneself in a split and divided way, good I against bad me, that is profoundly phony. And I think this was what Suzuki was getting at by his suddenly ceasing to talk about anything spiritual and talking only about his house and his garden. Because that has been one of the main streams of Buddhist way of life as it has come to this country, Japan, from China, to be what one might call the religion of non-religion. To be to find, to demonstrate, to convey what is the most highly spiritual through what is the most everyday and ordinary, and to make no division between the two. So that you might say the more everyday it is, the more truly spiritual it is. But the more it appears to be spiritual, that is to say, something different from, aside from, apart from everyday life, the more false that kind of spirituality will be.